Been asked to talk about user interfaces in Guile, how to build them and what you can use them for. So that's what I'm going to do. Can everybody hear me?
We can't see all the slides.
Well, does anyone know how to change it so we can?
Just change the resolution to 1024.
How do you do that in Geeks?
Do you have it on?
What have you done?
Escape or Q, right?
Okay, terminal.
We don't have an X-ray. Okay, I don't know.
These are just normal problems that you get when you're doing presentations. What works on your machine never works on an overhead projector.
Yeah. I don't know. We don't have.
Yeah, I suggest we go with it actually.
Yeah. They could have 11.
F11? What does F11 do?
I think it's full screen.
The window's full screen. Well, we can have half the screen like that.
Good enough.
Is that better? Yeah. But that's...
There you go.
Yeah, okay. Well, we'll run with it. So, what is a user interface? A user interface is the means by which the user and the computer interact. Typical examples are a shell, which all GNU/Linux systems have, at least all that I'm aware of. The REPL, which is common for Guile users, and of course graphical user interfaces. What does a user expect from their interface? Normally they want a means to give commands to the system. They've got to be able to tell the computer how to do something and when to do it. They want a means to determine the current state of the system. For example, in a shell, you type ls to see what files there are in the current directory. And a means to get, normally they want a means to get hints about what commands might be appropriate for the current status. So for example, in a shell you have, modern shells anyway, you've got tab completion, so you can hit the tab key and it will give you a list of possible ways to complete that command. When you're talking about graphical user interfaces, the users expect something somewhat more. A graphical user interface user, he normally wants instantaneous, well, not, when I say instantaneous, what I mean is automatic updates without any perceptible delay. And that should happen without the user actually having to do anything. Whereas a shell user is quite happy to have to type ls again to see what files may have in the last 5 seconds appeared or deleted. GUI users don't like that. They want to see things when something changes, they want to see it automatically appear on their screen. They want automatic notifications of successes. In the shell we don't normally like that. If something works after giving in a shell command, we expect it to silently return 0 and get on with the next thing. We don't like it saying stupid things. GUI users, however, prefer, normally the ones I've seen, they prefer to see some kind of confirmation that that command worked. They want explicit and verbose notifications of failures. So if something doesn't work, they want a very verbose pop-up or something to say that didn't work. Context-sensitive prompts, so they like to see that something well, if a command is not appropriate to be entered at that time, then that command should not be there. The button should be greyed out or not even there at all. So that's something that you have to think about if you're writing a graphical interface, is to only present what is appropriate for the current state. And confidence indicators. If there is a command that is going to take a long time, then they want some kind of indication that the machine is doing something and hasn't just sort of hung. So the exercise which I was charged with undertaking was to write a graphical installer for Geeks SD. We wanted an alternative to the shell or the REPL, because currently in Geeks SD the described way in the manual involves a number of shell commands to partition your disk, set up file systems, etc., etc., etc. And although many people are quite happy doing that, we think it would lower the barriers to entry if people who find those ways not so easy had a alternative means of doing it. So that's what we want. We want to give Geeks SD a graphical installer so that you can install it from a bare machine. But we don't want to force that on people. We want to still give the traditional old-timers a way of installing manually, and I believe we should actually allow for a compromise, so that if people like doing part of the job themselves, they can do, but for the other bits which are either too hard or too much of a hassle, they can give that off to the program to do for them. So the acceptance criteria were that the installer should be written in Guile, because everything else in Geeks is in Guile, and Ludo wasn't going to make an exception for me. It should have allow a complete installation from nothing, a machine with an empty disk, without having to use a shell or a REPL. But as I said, to allow experienced guys to use it if they want to. Right, it should be available in their own language and key map. There's just nothing more annoying when you're installing machines and the key layout that you've got in front of you isn't it doesn't conform to the key map that the machine is using. So if you're using a French keyboard, you hit the A key and a Q pops up. That annoys the French people. And the same with the Germans, with the Q and the Z being swapped over. So we want to be able to provide a way to get their own language and their own key map. It should work on an 80 by 25 terminal, because some machines don't have anything bigger, especially some of these little boxes that you see these days. And we want it to be intuitive as possible, so that you don't really need anyone to tell you how to use it. It should be more or less straightforward. So how does it work when you're setting up Geeks? Well, the task you've got to do, you've got to partition the disk. You must have at least one partition. You've got to say where those partitions, or where the file systems on those partitions should be mounted. You've got to tell them what kind of file system that you want, what parameters. Time zone is something that needs to be chosen for the system. The locale, the default locale, obviously each user can set their own one, but the system locale needs to be chosen. Packages, there might be some standard packages, well, there will be some standard packages that should be available for the entire system. As Ricardo said, usually they're installed, most packages are installed in the user profile so they don't affect all users. Services, which I think somebody else is talking about services later on, so I won't go into too much detail about those, but they need to be chosen. You've got to generate the config. Normally you need a network because Geeks is installed over the network. And then you've got to set the whole thing in motion. So those are the things you've got to do. A couple of constraints for this exercise. We cannot rely on any particular video drivers being available because all systems these days have different video systems, so we cannot say this installer is only going to work if you've got an SGI or a ATI or God knows what. You've got to use the lowest common denominator so that it'll be there when you've got pretty well a bare kernel. And of course we want to keep the installation image as small as possible because it has to fit on a USB device. Although they're quite large these days, they're not infinite. So how does it look so far? That's really a shame that we can't get the entire Yeah. Why is it that these overhead projector systems never work? No, I don't know. How about that? Yeah, that's more or less what it looks like. So there's a menu on the main screen. I can demonstrate this to people who are interested afterwards, but actually demonstrating it in real life now won't be, I don't think there'll be the time for that. There's a menu which you can do the steps individually. If a user though doesn't want to do the steps individually, they can choose the bottom one and it'll do everything and all its dependencies all at once. So that's the easy way for inexperienced people. But as I said, we've got these commands here. That's keyboard for F10, so change the keyboard map. F9 to change the language. So if you want it in German or French or whatever, you can, or at least you will be when the translators have done their job. And if you want a shell, you can hit F1 and you will get out to a shell, and when you hit exit, when you type exit in that shell, you'll come back to where you left off. And those three hotkeys will be available throughout the whole process, so you can do that at any time. And because we can't use a video driver, we decided to use curses. You're probably familiar with curses. It's a GNU package, and it provides an abstraction around the terminal capabilities. Each terminal in the world has a different way of being controlled, and curses abstracts that out. So there is a common way to, for example, draw a box on the screen, or or move the cursor to position XY on the screen, etc., etc. It also has a couple of higher level libraries which I might talk about a little bit better, but the main curses library is a C API. However, as I said earlier, this has got to be written in Guile. So fortunately there is a library called, or a package called Guile Curses. I think that is Mike Graham here? Oh, there he is right at the back. He's the maintainer of Guile Curses. And that is what we've used. And just very briefly going into how those menus work in curses, or Guile in curses. It has the means to display a menu like this. The user can move up and down and select items in the menu. If you were writing it in C, that would be the interface. You've got, well, you have to create an array of items, populate that array with a name and description, and create the menu, do whatever you want with the menu, and when you've finished, it's your responsibility to free that menu. And the lines that you can't see down here because of this system, you've then got to free the items if you don't want it to leak memory. How do you do that in Guile in curses? Similar way. Well, how would you do it? Similar way. Create a list of names, list of descriptions. Then, in this case, I've used a map and a lambda expression to create a list of items, each of which is a pair, and then create your menu here. So in theory, you can do that with Guile in curses, and there is a similar thing for forms if you want to create a form entry system, which I have done. My experience with them wasn't that successful, unfortunately. I found that first of all the way in which the forms and menus in curses are structured does not really lend themselves to scheme. I found that they were somewhat inflexible. The early versions were actually tending to crash every now and then, especially when the garbage collector ran at inappropriate moments, and I sent Mike there a few patches, and it's got a lot better in recent releases. But I'm still not confident that all the bugs have been ironed out. I have noticed occasions where it works most of the time, but then when the garbage collector runs when you don't expect it, then suddenly it crashes. And even if those problems have been fixed, as I say, I don't really think that the interface lends itself to scheme programming. Oh, and I'm not absolutely convinced that all the memory leaks have been ironed out. Perhaps we can talk afterwards, Mike, but yeah, I don't mean to pour cold water on your efforts, but anyway, either rightly or wrongly, I decided not to use the forms and menus libraries of Guile in curses. I wrote my own, which did an equivalent thing. Small set of modules, which did more or less the same, written entirely in scheme, but using the base curses. So I'm still using Guile in curses, I'm just not using their forms and menus implementation. Okay, thank you. Well, that's an example of how it does it. As we're running out of time, I'll skip that. But I think that way is a lot easier than the previous way that I showed you. Human factors we have to consider in user interfaces. This was an early screenshot of something I sent out for testing. They are not. This form actually got a lot of negative feedback from the people I asked to test, and I think the reason is obvious. There are too many controls on this screen. Some of them are not even appropriate. People didn't know what these buttons were going to do, which is understandable. It doesn't say. In fact, well, check actually runs FSCK, write will run MKFS to create the file system, and no, recreate does that. Write would run, yeah, exactly. If you don't know what it's going to do, then it's probably a poor design. So that's one lesson that we learned. Don't write your user interfaces too complicated. And that's been, in the new version, that's been changed quite considerably. Tech info, yeah, we need to have a system to turn tech info into something that curses can display. Those of you who are familiar with Guile know that there is this existing function called techie fragment to stechie, which converts things like, again we can't see this whole thing, the days of our lives with the bold in tech info into something more scheme friendly, which is a start of a paragraph, the days of, and in bold is our, and we're no longer bold here. That's existing in tech info, in Guile. I had to write a new procedure to actually turn this thing into something that curses will play nicely with, and I can show you that later if you're interested. So the status so far, what's been done? Well, we've got a reasonably complete curses-based installer. It has been sent out for first testing. Users have reported that it does work. They have been able to do a complete installation of Geeks SD without having to resort to a shell. And I believe those people have used different hardware and different network systems, etc., etc. So it basically all works. Problems? Well, as I said earlier, the problems that I find is that we are lacking on Guile bindings. Another problem I found is that there is no current way that I've found to get the kernel to tell us when something has changed. I have to poll it, and that is not a nice way of doing things. This is a brief procedure I wrote to get around the first problem, the lack of bindings. What I basically have to do is screen scrape commands. So I run a command in a pipe and collect the output that comes onto standard out and then post-process it. Also not nice, but it does work. Here's how I do my polling for changes. I just use sig alarm to poll every second. Again, not nice, but it works. But what can one do without the infrastructure? What we don't have yet in the system is mouse support. That I'm trying to work out. But I'm actually finding that, unfortunately, whereas it can work on an Xterm, you don't have an Xterm when you boot up your machine. You've got a frame buffer terminal, and I'm not sure if that can work with that. LVM, full disk encryption, that's not supported as yet, and neither is adding users. A lot of people said they want an option to add users. I normally consider that a post installation task, but some people like to do it at the time of installation, apparently. Here's some ideas that some people came up with, and I'm still trying to work out whether they're good ideas or not. Tool tips, so that if you hover the mouse over a button, that you might get some text saying what it's going to do, or you select that button without actually activating it.
You should switch to question time.
Questions?
And the new speaker should set up.
Okay, so perhaps the new system can come. So, yeah. Okay, questions? Yes?
If you had so much trouble with writing Guile n curses bindings or rewriting. Have you also considered writing the n curses things in C and then expose the high-level interface functions to Guile? So that
Well, that's basically what Guile n curses does or tries to do. And I didn't have that much trouble writing the menus in Guile when I wrote my own libraries to do that. I had a lot more trouble using the Guile n curses interface.
All right, thank you to John.
Yeah, pull that out.